Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins, and this podcast, Green Socialist Notes. Well, first, let me introduce myself. I was the Green Party candidate in 2020, also the Socialist Party candidate. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And if I seem a little frazzled, it's because somebody tried to break into my car again. It's getting it's repetitive and frustrating. And so I had to climb in through the back because they broke the handle off the, driver's side door. It's, electronic these days. I got a Hyundai. Hyundais and Kias, it's like the kids, at least around upstate New York, they compete with each other to steal them. The problem is they break into my car and it's a standard transmission. And they don't know how to drive that. So, they break in and then they leave it. So usually they break the window. Now they broke the handle, which is probably going to be more expensive. So anyway, I just found that out a few minutes ago. But let me just follow up to start discussion here with a little more on the Mamdani campaign. Some people have got back to me saying I was too critical of Mamdani last week. And what I try to do is, put what happened in that election in a larger, realistic context. And I did give him credit for running an excellent campaign with the canvassing and, concrete reforms that people could believe were possible instead of abstractions. But I also pointed out, and I still maintain this, that, the indications of his campaign is that he wants a place in the Democratic Party coalition, which is still dominated by big capitalists. And those big capitalists in New York City, particularly Wall Street finance and real estate tycoons, are going to try to block Mamdani's reforms with their private economic power. They can divest, they can invest, they can make municipal bond financing difficult, and they got the corporate media, which will be his enemy. So, as I've advocated for decades, we need our own party that's about replacing that power structure, not just getting a place within it. And I also pointed out that, the vote a week ago, Tuesday, November 4th, was a massive anti-Trump vote, but that Mamdani underperformed other Democratic candidates in terms of their margins of victory. And let me just add a few more numbers I've run across since last week. Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey and Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, they won by 14% compared to Mamdani's, 2% if you count Sliwa and Cuomo together. And they won their states by 14% compared to what Kamala Harris got in 2024. She won those states by 8%. It was the same numbers in both states. And then in New York City, Mamdani ran 18% behind Kamala Harris, who got 68% of the vote in New York City in 2024. So it's doesn't indicate a shift to the left within New York City. And as I pointed out, Mamdani's 50.4% victory is the same as David Dinkins' victory in 1989, who was also a DSA member who beat Rudy Giuliani in that race. Eric Adams, who's a moderate Democrat and now, scandal-ridden, he won by 67% 4 years ago. Bill de Blasio, who was more of a liberal candidate, although he kind of switched to the left as the campaign went on, he won by 73%. With a 73% vote in his first election and 66% in his second. So Mamdani's mandate is a lot lower than those. So I maintain the conclusion I gave last week that November 4th was a massive anti-Trump vote. It was a nationalized election, except in New York City, where the vote was localized and polarized around the same class and race issues that have plagued New York City since 1989 when Dinkins won and before. So I'm sobered by the narrowness and the persistent racial polarization in the New York City electorate. Of course, we should support Mamdani's reforms: free childcare, free buses, rent freeze, and taxing the rich and the corporations to pay for those reforms. But we should not accept the notion that a lot of people are now concluding that the left should run candidates inside the Democratic Party instead of against it and the Republicans. And I still maintain we need an eco-socialist left party that makes clear to the public and builds a mandate to restructure political and economic power, not just elect a few people into the power structure. So, we'll watch and see what happens. I hope Mamdani can get his reforms through. But as I pointed out, he's got to go against his own party in terms of those tax reforms he needs to pay for much of his reform program. So I'll just leave that there for people to chew on. I think an interesting development this week is around the Epstein files, and they're revealing cracks in Trump's coalition. Trump is obviously afraid of something in those files, but his base wants the files released. And Trump is getting desperate. He just called Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marjorie Trader Greene, because she's been pushing for the files to be released. And Greene responded, Jesus is her savior, not Trump, and she serves her district, not Trump. And I think we're going to see a Republican jailbreak when they finally do vote on releasing the Epstein files, because those people got to answer to their base, which wants the files released. And here we got Trump, who's 38 times a convicted felon, tried to steal the 2020 election. And, there are all kinds of scandals. I mean, the latest one is he and his family have corruptly made $5 billion from pumping and dumping Trump-branded crypto coins, a process still going on. But none of that seems to have stuck on him except the Epstein scandal. So, get your popcorn out. This is going to be interesting, and we'll see what happens. And then I kind of want to spend some time, I foreshadowed it last week, about the international situation. The U.S. does not have an official delegation at COP30, the climate summit. It's not going to have one at the G20 next week. And so another scandal that ought to stick on Trump and, the whole U.S. establishment is the climate crisis. But it's not. The planet is burning, and Trump is adding fuel to that fire by, opposing renewable energy and pushing fossil fuels. It's insane. So at the G20, it's not only the U.S. boycotting, it's Argentina, China, Mexico, and Russia, all for different reasons. But they're not going to be there. And I think, for one, this indicates a growing deterioration of multilateral international institutions as major wars are raging in Palestine, Ukraine, Sudan, and many other smaller wars in other parts of the world. I think the fact that so many major countries are not going to the G20 meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, indicates great power disrespect for Africa. They just don't have any respect or think it's important to go there. And South Africa, has tried to play a role in international issues. In this meeting at the G20, they were hoping to get consensus agreements on international financing for a just energy transition to carbon-free renewables and for debt relief for the global South. But no agreements on those problems are going to come out with all the G20 countries consenting to them, nor will there be any movement on peace in Ukraine and Palestine, both of which South Africa has been active in trying to promote peace with its own diplomacy. And then, to make matters worse, the U.S. is scheduled to take over the presidency of the G20 after the summit for the next year. And I'm afraid under Trump, that can only mean further deterioration of multilateral cooperation because of his America First bullying, which we're seeing big time now in the Caribbean. So the thing I mentioned last week that I just left because I'd spoken long enough, in my notes is how new modes of warfare are undermining the international order and the need for Green Party to have real peace policies to deal with this. Now, this new mode of warfare is based on long-range airstrikes on civilians, not so much ground forces confronting each other on a battle line, because now we got these reconnaissance and killer drones that create a kill zone that is, 10 or 20 miles wide. It even keeps the ground forces from really reaching each other, face to face along a battle line. So we see this in Russia's war on Ukraine. Russia's striking civilians and civilian heat and power infrastructure, hundreds of miles beyond the front lines. It's terrorism towards civilians. And Ukraine is responding. They're not striking civilians, but they're striking oil refineries and shipping infrastructure. I mean, there was missile attacks by Ukraine on this port, Novorossiysk, something like that. I'm not good on my pronunciations, on the Black Sea, which is a major oil export port for Russia. So it's a new kind of warfare. And the thing is that civilians are the victims in the case of Russia's war on Ukraine. We see the same thing in Israel's war, and with U.S. weapons on Gaza and other Middle Eastern countries. Israel's, airstrikes, long-range strikes, particularly on civilians, as well as military targets in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, Syria. And, the response from groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and Iran has been rocket attack, and the Houthis, rocket attacks that hit civilian targets in Israel. So, targeting civilians is a war crime, but that's what's going on in those two wars. And then we got America's war on Venezuela and maybe more. We got these boat strikes. Now, I forget how many, it's over 80 killed. Summary executions, no due process for suspected drug carriers, but we're now getting reports that from the families of people that were killed that they were just fishermen. So that's a war crime. And so the incentive for militaries now is to achieve strategic effect through attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure. And to the extent ground forces fight on the battlefield, it's just a slow, bloody slog through these kill zones that the drones police. So the long-range war crimes with airstrikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure is seen as faster and more effective. And of course, this mode of warfare is morally bankrupt, but it is strategically rational if you want to defeat the other side. And it's the future of war unless the Greens and the left internationally can advocate peace policies for international institutions that can really enforce international law against war crimes. And in the longer term, negotiate new mutual security and disarmament agreements among the big military powers. And this has just not been on the agenda. Nothing like it was debated in the last couple of presidential elections. It was one of my three big issues, but I didn't get any attention in 2020. The anybody but Trump thing was so strong that, I had the opportunity. I spent 5 hours talking with Daniel Ellsberg, three of them privately and one of them on a podcast. And I was the only guy saying, Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, I think it's called. I forget now, The Doomsday. Anyway, it's how if we, start a nuclear war, it's automated. All the nukes will go off, and it's the Doomsday Machine. And, he said that's fine, but we got to, focus on defeating Trump. And so, it was never debated, but, it's something that if the Green Party has any purpose, it's got to bring these things to the fore. So what we're seeing is a disappearance of any restraint by these military powers and the normalization of these war crimes. I mean, states that used to at least appear like they were not committing, wanted to appear like they were not committing war crimes. And now that pretense is over. And in fact, they revel in their war crimes. I mean, the Russians, they have this, what the Ukrainians call human safaris, where they use first-person view FPV drones to target civilians, who are just walking down the street, driving in their car, pushing a cart. They target pets, children, anybody. And then they post it on their Telegram channels and say, see what we did. So you got the human safaris by Russia in Ukraine. Of course, Israel, the dehumanization of Palestinians by them to justify their war crimes is just appalling. And of course, the U.S., at least from the Trump side, is glorifying their summary executions of people in the Caribbean. And I sense that most Americans are not buying the administration's propaganda on these things. It's only in the racist, anti-immigrant hardcore of MAGA world. But I think that's unlike, Russia and Israel, where they dehumanize, they have these racist attitudes toward Palestinians and Ukrainians. So that's a problem. And the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, or the World Court, these big powers are just defying them now. Russian, Israeli, and Hamas leaders have been indicted by the ICC. The Hamas indictments are moot because those leaders are dead now. But these countries are just defying the arrest warrants. And so are other countries where these people travel, like particularly the U.S. Netanyahu's been here, Putin's been here, and they're under arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court, and the U.S. just wants them. And in fact, the U.S. has sanctioned International Criminal Court judges and prosecutors over their indictments of Israeli leaders. So, the U.S. is really undermining this system. They talk about a rules-based order coming out of World War II, international humanitarian law codified in the UN Charter, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the 1949 Geneva Convention on the Laws of War. And so we promote those, except when we don't, because it's not convenient for U.S. interests. So they're breaking these laws with impunity, with no expectation that anybody will be charged. And many smaller militaries are following the example of the big powers, often as proxies of the big powers. Think of the Rapid Support Forces and the armed forces of in Sudan, the Islamists and the government battles across the Sahel, the Rwandan and Congolese armed forces in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and elsewhere. This is even the pretense of the idea of international law and war crimes is being eroded. So I think this is where the Greens and all democratic left parties of the world need to step up and advance peace policies based on adherence and enforcement of international humanitarian law. And in the U.S., we really have to start this by repudiating the U.S. record of imperialism and war crimes and say, now we're going to become the world's humanitarian superpower and offer reparations for war damages, for the exploitation of labor without fair compensation due to the support for repressive governments by our military interventions, the extraction of natural resources without fair compensation, and the destruction of ecosystems and the climate. And, I've advocated that these reparations should come in the form of a global and eco-socialist Green New Deal that helps other countries, particularly the poor countries, meet their basic needs for the universal provision of adequate food, clean water, healthcare, and basic education, and a transition to clean energy enough to support a high modern quality of life. And as we talked about on this podcast, January 7, 2023, with David Schwartzman, the climate scientist who was in the DC Statehood Green Party and passed away last July, adequate energy means about 3.5 kilowatts per person, which means we need to increase global energy production from about 18 trillion watts today to 20 or 25 trillion watts of clean energy. That means we need to grow the clean energy sector while we degrow the fossil fuel and nuclear sectors and the military industrial complex. So that's what we talked about with David now almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, about the discussion of degrowth. It's we got to grow some sectors while we degrow others. And while Russia and Israel are the most obvious violators of international humanitarian law today, and the U.S. is really complicit with Israel and what's going on in Palestine, it is the U.S. for decades that has been violating international humanitarian law with its massive war crimes, from Vietnam to Iraq to now Palestine, and many other places over the decades. So it's not surprising that Russian top officials cite U.S. precedents in their violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine today, in Syria not too long ago. Their mercenary forces used to be called Wagner, now called the Africa Corps, in the Sahel and some other African countries. And they're doing that with the realistic expectation that they'll be exempt from punishment for their war crimes. And I'm saying international humanitarian law, not simply international law, because there are international laws that we should be challenging, particularly the neoliberal profit and market-based international economic laws codified in the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which that's what has come out of these climate summits, the COP meetings, because those are increasing inequalities and increasing the destruction of the environment. So the international humanitarian law that we should put forward as a reform program should democratize the enforcement of international humanitarian law. So what does that mean? It means we should be pushing for reforms like at the UN Security Council, eliminating the veto that the US and Russian war criminals have used to prevent UN action against their crimes. Another reform would be to prohibit a country affected by a Security Council resolution from voting on it. They should be recused. Another reform people have talked about is expanding the Security Council to include more representation from the underrepresented regions of the global South, particularly Africa. And I think even more than reforming the Security Council is we got to push for strengthening the role of the UN General Assembly. And one thing that we can do and push, and the Assembly can do itself, is to use its Uniting for Peace powers when the Security Council fails to act. And we've been talking about that in the Green Party with respect to Palestine and the idea of the UN General Assembly authorizing a stabilization force to go in and protect the Palestinians from the Israelis in Gaza and the West Bank. There's a lot going on there too. And as I've discussed this a few times on this podcast, I think morally and legally there's complete justification for those things. I just question militarily how it could be done. But I'm open to hearing ideas about that. But in any case, the Assembly could, override the Security Council. They have that Uniting for Peace power. They have precedents for it. We talked about the 1956 Suez Crisis, where France, Britain, and Israel invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal. And the US and the Soviet Union at the time got together and said, no, you don't. It's too destabilizing. And if you do, you're losing all the support from us. And right away, France, Britain, and Israel backed off. So that is a precedent that the General Assembly should draw on. And then for the United States, I mean, we've got to get into these international institutions. We should join the International Criminal Court and accept the authority of the International Court of Justice, the World Court. International Criminal Court goes after individuals guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the International Court of Justice, or World Court, punishes or adjudicates, what happens when nations collectively violate those laws. So we are formally part of the International Court of Justice or World Court, but we don't accept its authority. In other words, we're okay when they go after somebody else, but not us. And hypocrisy just undermines the whole idea of international law. And so since 1986, we don't accept the court's rulings if we don't like them. And that's, we can't participate in a just international order unless we're part of it. And then there are dozens of humanitarian law conventions and treaties that the U.S. has not become a part of. And I'll just give you a handful of them compared to their dozens. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. You'd think Trump pulled us out of that, but we've never been in it. The Convention on the Rights of the Child. The International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. We were guilty of that with the secret renditions to black sites under the Bush-Cheney administration. The Landmine Ban Treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Protocol to the Convention Against Torture, which, think of Abu Ghraib. We would have people that would be guilty under that convention. And then it means the U.S. getting serious again about arms control. We withdrew from the ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, under the Bush administration, and I think it was 2003. The the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in the first Bush administration, also the Open Skies Treaty, which allows basically the observation of each side's nuclear facilities between Russia and the United States. And then the SALT agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, that it's now called New SALT, that expires in a few months, I think in February. And that needs to be renegotiated, and it's not happening. And then also, I think we should be advocating, I proposed these peace policies when I ran in 2020. The U.S., and this is to tell the world, we're going to stop being an aggressive imperialist power and we want to move towards peace. And here are some gestures. We should pledge no first use of nuclear weapons, which China and India have done. We should unilaterally disarm our nukes to a minimum credible deterrent so they're not so threatening. I advocated for a cut in the military budget of 75%. That would still leave us plenty to fulfill any role in multilateral peacekeeping, as well as defending our own country. And then from that military budget cuts, we invest the savings in a global Green New Deal. And like I said, be the world's humanitarian superpower instead of its military superpower, and make friends instead of enemies, and reduce some of the economic motives for war, which is competition for resources and markets and so forth. And then really use diplomacy and international law to promote peace, human rights, and democracy. Those kind of policies, unilaterally undertaken by the U.S., would enable us to go to the other nuclear powers in the world and say, look, the U.S. is no longer a threat, and we want to negotiate, move toward complete and universal disarmament, starting with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I forget the number of countries, but it's in effect now. And a lot of countries around the world have signed on to this, but unfortunately, none of the nuclear powers. And it's going to take, some people say, well, why don't we just get rid of all our nukes? A lot of people believe we need that deterrent. It's just not going to pass domestically, but we can, I believe, move toward mutual disarmament among the nuclear powers to the point where we can all sign on to this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And, given what's going on in the world right now, I think peace policies like these are needed more than ever as the big military powers move into this new mode of warfare based on long strikes against civilians. It's Russia and Ukraine, it's the US and the Caribbean, it's Israel all over the Middle East with US weapons. This is not going to end well unless we change course. And of course, the Democrats and the Republicans don't, and they're not going to advance these kinds of peace policies. That's why we need the Green Party. So I'm going to stop there. I've been going for half an hour, but let's hear your thoughts. Scout 164, any thoughts on Bill Clinton being called Bubba in Epstein emails? Well, that was a nickname some people gave to Clinton, and I think what Epstein said in that file is Trump was blowing Bubba. I mean, these are like the richest people that are supposed to be leading the world. Epstein was in the middle of all that. I mean, the elite circles in this country, they need to be cut down to size because they're crude and they're childish and they're a danger to the world. That's my thought on that. Epstein, and who was he communicating with that email? It was to, who was he sending that to? Oh, it might have been to a Russian who he was advising on how to handle Trump, if I remember correctly. I mean, these people aren't fit to run a village, let alone the world. Andrew Hager. Speaking of the Epstein files, Howie, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your excitement over their release? 6, 7. I'm not sure what's in them. I'm more concerned about issues like climate change and war and, the immiseration of working people in the United States. But I am curious, to see what more comes out when they're released. And then the political consequences of that, are hard to fathom. It may discredit Trump, but will it, further underride or undermine the MAGA base, which is, I see, is about a third of the country that is, basically, white supremacist and xenophobic. And the only good thing I can say about them is that they're shrinking. When Nixon and Wallace ran in 68 together, I think they got 62% of the vote. Now they command about half of that. So we're making progress. The unfortunate thing is that given our the anti-democratic nature of our system, winner-take-all elections, political gerrymandering, a Senate that disproportionately empowers those conservative sections of the country, a Supreme Court that doesn't give a damn about the Constitution, just about their right-wing, politics. So what I'm saying is the base may be eroding, but the elites from that base are still in power, and it's going to be a fight to dislodge them. So how the Epstein files disclosures feed into that, I hope it does erode the base. We'll see. Kevin Rosa. Do you think the U.S. should take military action against Israel to end the genocide and deliver aid to Gaza? Israel clearly has no intention of stopping the genocide on their own. Yes, the U.S. should, the U.S. won't. So that brings us back to the UN General Assembly and a Uniting for Peace proposal. And that's where I have the military question. What coalition of military forces is going to take on the nuclear fanatics ruling Israel and the U.S., because the U.S. is going to back Israel if there's a military confrontation? So that's why I say it's morally justified, it's legally justified, but is there a plausible military operation that could actually do that? And in the meantime, what we need to be pushing for in the United States is an arms embargo of Israel and in other countries. And, that's more and more happening around the world, not yet in the US. The best we got was 23 senators voting against some bills to provide, where the resolutions were to stop providing offensive weapons to Israel. And Sanders got that voted on in April. That was a little better than he got the previous November when I think it was between 15 and 17 senators. So little progress there. But as a measuring stick of where we are, that's barely a quarter, not even a quarter of the Senate, not even half of the Democratic caucus, or about half. So that's where we are. And then in the House side, there is similar legislation, but Johnson isn't going to bring it forward. You could theoretically get a discharge petition to force a vote, but I don't think they can get 218 members of the House to do that. Most of the Republicans, maybe one or two of the Republicans might consider it, like this guy from Kentucky who just pushed the Epstein, the procedures called, the petition for, I forget the name of the procedure, but it forces a vote, and then it needs a majority of the House members. And that guy in Kentucky, whose name's blank, leaving me right now, together with Ro Khanna, introduced that. He might be against sending more military weapons to Israel on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, what are we going to get? 25, 50 at the most of the House members. There are over 200 of them. I mean, we're about in the same situation. So we have a lot of work to do right here. If the U.S. stopped providing weapons to Israel, it would limit their ability to carry out their genocide and ethnic cleansing, which is what they're doing on the West Bank now. They're trying to make life so miserable that Palestinians self-deport, and they're killing them. Over 1,000 have been killed since October 7th on the West Bank by settlers and the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. And, the U.S. could stop that. We do have the leverage over Israel, but we're not using it. In fact, we're backing Israel, and particularly under Trump. Well, God, under Biden, he was Israel right or wrong, like Trump is. In fact, Trump actually, checked Netanyahu a couple of times on, the bombing of Iran. That was limited. This peace agreement, this ceasefire that's going on now, it's not really a ceasefire, but it's not a full-scale invasion. Trump forced Netanyahu's hand on that. So, we got. It hasn't been as bad under Trump as it was under Biden when it comes to the genocide of Palestinians. I mean, that's just how pathetic it is. And why we need the Green Party? Because the Democratic Party is captured by the military-industrial interests that see Israel as their land-based aircraft carrier in the Middle East to project power there and control, the important things in that region like oil. It's so, yeah, the U.S. should take military action. It won't, and we got to push for an arms embargo. I think that's what we can do right now, and encourage the UN to do some kind of uniting for peace proposal, even if they call for a stabilization force, and they can't bring together sufficient military people. It would be an important statement. So, yeah, that's a bad situation, and the U.S. is totally guilty in the genocide. Charles Keener, I don't believe Iran or its allies target civilians in Israel. They target military targets, but civilians are killed. Conversely, Israel deliberately and gleefully attacks civilians. Big difference. Well, I don't know about Iran, exactly what their military targets were in Israel. But I certainly think you can say with the rockets fired by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, um, they don't have much military impact, and they do hit civilian areas, and they are not accurate enough to avoid civilians. So, um, you could say Israel is guilty on a much larger scale. I'd agree with that. But I think, and then you've got the terrorist actions undertaken by groups that Iran has supported, and Hamas has conducted, Islamic Jihad has conducted against Israeli civilians. You know, just murdering Israeli civilians as a form of resistance, which I think backfires because it alienates whatever allies they might have in Israel, as well as many Palestinians. I mean, there are a lot of Palestinians, take the people around the Palestinian National Initiative led by Mustafa Barghouti, who, condemn those kinds of actions and say that given the balance of military forces, the best strategy is a nonviolent one that can build international support that can then reign in Israel. And, the U.S. is the linchpin there. So, the opposition to Israel, the resistance, it's been a lot of terrorism and targeting of civilians. I don't think that's deniable. October 7th, there were a lot of civilians killed by Hamas when they went in to those kibbutzes. When they went in, I would say the military targets, that was legitimate, even if tactically or strategically as a military operation, I have questions. But, when they started, going after civilians, that's terrorism. And it's both sides have been doing this. And the more they do it, it's a cycle of violence that keeps getting worse. Vicky Corden, any thoughts about Christian churches denying baby formula to people in need? I'm not referring to. I'm not. Haven't seen any news about that. But what you describe is very unchristian in terms of Christian ethics. So, that's my thought. What kind of self-respecting Christian denies baby formula to people in need? It's not what Christ would have done. Or what would Jesus do, as they say? Jesus wouldn't have done that. Andrew Hager, any advice you can give me on how to talk to my friends and family members who voted for Trump and convince them to help take back our country from him? Well, I think there are two levels to it. One is, the rational, factual basis. And, you can just point out, you got to find out what motivated them to vote for Trump. Was it he was going to lower prices? He hasn't done that. And, his tariff and other policies are not doing that. So you got a rational basis there. If they agreed with him that, they want to, get, people of color out of, government positions, military positions, universities, and that kind of thing, I think you can, shame them morally that is not right. If they're Christians, you can say that's not what Jesus would do. So, I think you can appeal to people's sense of right and wrong. You can talk about how Trump's policies are, not delivering for what people need. And then I think, ridicule. Trump deserves ridicule. He's a figure of ridicule. He's like a kid on a playground in the kind of things he says and does. And, I guess, I talk to my friends and family. Well, I frankly don't have family members who are Trumpies, and friends, I don't really have friends. I have acquaintances. I run into people. I talk to them about it. But I know in those discussions, most people won't defend Trump's behavior. And then, the question is, well, do you really want an immature, unfeeling sociopath like that running the United States. So that's the best I can offer. Good luck. Aaron Ingebrigtsen. I'm still scared of compressed CO2 pipelines exploding. Yeah, I mean, we have methane explosions occasionally. Carbon dioxide pipelines, those would be what, captured CO2 that they're pumping out to like oil fields to get more oil out of them. I'm not that familiar with that problem. It's vaguely bringing back news stories I've read, but we shouldn't be building CO2 pipelines with so-called captured CO2. If we want to put CO2 back into Earth, there's the idea of accelerating geological sequestration of CO2. And, for example, you put carbonated water into basalt rock formations, and the carbon becomes carbonate in the rock formation and is there for, eons. And the process of doing that is, there have been experiments in Iceland. They haven't so far been successful, but the concept, I think, is worth pursuing. And then, we still haven't nearly exhausted the natural sequestration we can do by, reforestation and, improving biomass on the land and in the sea. There was an interesting article, I think it was I guess it was the Washington Post, Dana Milbank, who I'm not a big fan of normally, but he had a great article on how, most people, there's a saying that a squirrel could go from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast without ever touching the ground because you had nothing but forest in the eastern United States. When the, European settlers got here, that's not true. The indigenous peoples managed that land through setting up farms and also controlled fires, so that a lot of that land was grassland, savanna type area, which was good for them for game. And also what these scientists found is that 8 times more carbon can be sequestered in grasslands than in forests, because it goes into the root system, and then when the roots rot out, it stays in the ground as soil, as opposed to carbon being sequestered in wood. It's just a much faster and larger scale carbon sequestration, which is interesting. It may indicate we should, as we cut down, particularly this was an eastern woodland kind of forest, as we cut them down for timber or whatever, we have the land by turning it into grasslands, and we would sequester more carbon. In any case, natural carbon sequestration by enhancing landscapes, ecosystems. Wetlands is another one that is another system that sequesters a lot of carbon. That is, the immediate thing we should be doing before, we have this carbon and capture schemes outside fossil fuel power plants, which is, what they're doing is that, and then they pipe the carbon dioxide and pump it into oil wells to push out more oil, which, that all that does nothing to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. At best, it recycles it. So, I'm scared of compressed pipelines, not just for the explosions, but also for the implications for climate. Charles Keener, Comparing Mamdani's votes to right-wing establishment Dems in New York City, who had relatively little opposition, is bogus. Mamdani had a tsunami of tens of millions of dollars on racist, Islamophobic, red baiting, hate propaganda. He was massively outspent. You got more votes than any candidate since the 1960s. For a pro-Palestinian to get 1/3 of the Jewish votes in New York City is a massive breakthrough. I see a glass at least half full. Sorry, you do not. Sadly, there are lots of sour grapes, ultra-left, knives out, I think is how it goes. I'm waiting for the second part of the message to come up, if it does. Well, okay, so I wouldn't say that the Democrats that I mentioned that got higher votes than Mamdani didn't have, serious opposition. Well, I guess Adams, who did he have? Sleva? Yeah, that wasn't that serious. And de Blasio, yeah, he didn't, I'd agree, he didn't get the degree of opposition that Mamdani did. But in the end, the voters voted for that right-wing opposition. And that's why I'm sobered. Not to take, Mamdani ran a great campaign, but to, barely get over 50% is sobering to me. And, the Jewish vote in New York City, other discussions, I've had discussions with you, Charles, online, with other people I've had is they say that they believe that a majority of Jews voted for Mamdani because the number we get that 1/3 from is a CNN exit poll, which goes by religion. And they argue that a lot of Jews are, Jewish by descent, but not by religion. So when they answer the question, what's their religion? They say, agnostic, other, atheist, and not Jewish. And so they argue that, Mamdani actually got a majority of the Jews in New York City to vote for him. And, that's a plausible argument. I think it would take some more detailed polling to find out the real answer to that. So anyway, I'm just trying to put a little context on there because, the big conclusion that a lot of people enthusiastic for Mamdani are saying is, see, we can do this inside the Democratic Party. And we'll watch this going forward, but the Democratic Party is not going to be an ally for Mamdani's modest reform program. They're just not. They don't want to, pass his millionaire's tax, 2% on income over $1 million, or an increase in the corporate tax rate to support these reforms in New York City. And then Trump's got $7 billion worth of money going to New York City that he can play around with. So it's going to be a real fight. I think, we should support Mamdani on his fight with Trump, which is probably going to be another show to get your popcorn out for. So anyway, do I see the glass is half empty? I guess I would say so. It's half full, half empty. It's two ways of looking at it. I'm just a little more skeptical, I think, than a lot of people on the broad left are about what's going to come of this election. But I hope I'm wrong. Andrew Hager, is there a chance that relationships between friends and family can be improved by the end of Trump's reign of terror, particularly with those who currently are used to support Trump? Same question regarding relations between the U.S. and many other countries. Yeah, I think Trump is polarizing by intent. And if he leaves the scene, the question is who tries to, ride his base to stay in power or get in power. Are they as effective as in being polarizing, or, has that run its course to some degree? And I think the same with, relationships between the U.S. and many other countries. From what I read, reporting, the leadership of other countries despise Trump. They think he's a damn idiot. But the problem is he's president in the United States of America, and that means a lot of military and economic power. So, I'm thinking now particularly of the Europeans, they are like sort of praising him to his face while they cuss him out behind his back. And I think in the global South, they got to do the same thing, or else, they're worried about tariffs. They're worried about, well, not so much foreign aid anymore because we cut most of it off. And then they're worried about, U.S. military adventurism. Trump ran as the peace candidate who was going to end forever wars, and now he's about to get into some kind of mess in Venezuela, which is hard to predict. But, I think they're definitely aiming for regime change. I think that's Rubio's agenda. I think that's his portfolio. There was another high official in the Trump administration with the last name Grinnell who got a bunch of concessions from Maduro on oil, U.S. companies involved in the oil industry in Venezuela. And basically Maduro's saying, whatever you need, you got. And, the Rubio side is saying that's not enough. We got to, get our own puppet in there. How they do that, I don't think they can. Because I don't think Machado, who is the nominal opposition leader, really has support. A lot of the people who voted against Maduro, from the working classes, they hate Machado too. They just, wanted Maduro out of there for a lot of reasons, economic and political. So, you get rid of Maduro, who takes his place? I mean, there's reporting of how the U.S. is talking to different generals, so you get a military dictatorship in there. But there's other reporting saying that going back to Chavez, they purged the military of all officers who would look for power for themselves or on behalf of the right wing. So, I'm just sort of thinking out loud about what I've been reading. I'm not sure what they're up to, but I think they're up to making a mess. Because the problems of Venezuela, the Venezuelans got to solve. And, the U.S. Marines are not about nation building. They're about blowing things up and killing people. That's their mission. And that's a war mission. It's not a, state building mission. So I think this is no good's going to come of what the Trump administration is doing right now. And gonna do. Well, that went fast from my end. I know I spoke a long time. I see a lot of questions in the chat, which I haven't been able to keep up as we're going. I'm just skimming through them to see if there's something I definitely got to answer now, but wow, there are a lot of them. Okay, I'm reading one of them now. Okay, this is a comment from someone who's responding to Charles Keener. You can read it in the chat. I'm going to leave that alone. And I'll wrap it up for this week. I think soon I'm going to have a guest from Georgia on. I haven't made the request yet. They're in a very difficult situation. The Georgia Dream, led by the richest man in Georgia, is cracking down. It's becoming more repressive. And I was looking at Transparency International, comparing the levels of corruption that they register, and I was comparing Ukraine, which has this kickback scheme that the anti-corruption agencies revealed this week, and some people are saying, "See, we shouldn't give any support to Ukraine." So I compared it to Russia, Hungary, and Georgia, the Putin allies in the region, and all those countries have become more corrupt by Transparency International's measuring indication. They have an index they publish every year, and Ukraine has got better. So Ukraine still has a lot of work to do on anti-corruption, but it's doing better than Putin and his allies in the region, including Georgia. So anyway, that's something maybe coming up soon. And I have a number of other ideas, but for now, whether I have a guest or not, I'll be here again, 3 o'clock next Saturday, and we'll talk about current events and possibly with a guest. In the meantime, everybody, please stay active. It makes a difference, and do it inside a group, not just solo. You're going to get smarter, and you're just going to feel better about things if you're doing it that way. And I just had a crack of thunder and lightning, so we got a storm here. Anyway, I'll see y'all next week, and thanks for being here this week.